There was a time when Vince McMahon's biggest opposition was World Championship Wrestling, and before that, the National Wrestling Alliance. However, there is a sweet spot that bridged the gap between these 2 points in history. A sweet spot that really doesn't get brought up nearly as much as it should. But we're about to change all that. Because today... This episode comes as a result of the exclusive polls over on Patreon, and speaking of which, I want to give a big thank you to all of my Patreon supporters out there, like Dakari Garmin, Jess K, and The Woos. And also, brand new exclusive Patreon polls are up right now, so go ahead, sign up, and make sure that you vote. And with that out the way, let's get into the episode. Jim Crockett Promotions was founded by... Jim Crockett. No real surprise there. And also, he was a promoter, I guess, also no real big surprise there. But what some of you may not know is that he also promoted other shows like concerts and theater, as well as other sports like baseball and hockey. And furthermore, what some of you might find interesting is despite the name of the company clearly reflecting the name of its founder, the company wasn't always named that, at least not all the time. In 1931, Jim Crockett started his wrestling organization as a regional company for the Carolinas and Virginia. Now, it was officially named after him, but unofficially it ran under many different names from time to time, with names such as Mid-Atlantic Wrestling, East Coast Wrestling, Championship Wrestling, All-Star Wrestling, Worldwide Wrestling, and Wide World Wrestling all being just some of the monikers that JCP went through as brand names for specific shows, as it would be called any of these names on TV, radio, and even be printed on tickets. So if you were in the area back in the day and you saw a professional wrestling show that was named one of these, well, you probably saw a Jim Crockett show and didn't even know it. Moving forward to 1952, Jim Crockett would join the National Wrestling Alliance, and the territory would start going by Mid-Atlantic Wrestling as their primary advertised name. But the true moniker of Jim Crockett Promotions was still indeed intact. Then, in 1973, John Ringley was heading things up temporarily before Jim Crockett Jr., the oldest son, would officially be placed in charge with the Crockett family taking over. But one of the biggest contributions that Ringley made during its short time at the top was bringing in one of the best bookers of the time, George Scott. No, not that George Scott. Now, Scott was a professional wrestler himself, part of the duo known as the Flying Scots, but interestingly enough, despite being a tag team wrestler himself, Scott actually started pulling focus away from JCP's tag division, even though that's what they were most known for. Fans didn't take too well to this initially, but when Scott started bringing in top stars like Wahoo McDaniel, the Super Destroyer, and John Valentine, they eventually began to turn around. And Scott also brought in young talent too, with fresh faces such as Roddy Piper, Ricky Steamboat, and a young Ric Flair, just to name a few. But don't get me wrong, tag team wrestling was by no means abandoned at this time, it just wasn't a central focus as it once was, with them concentrating more on developing singles acts. Another alteration to JCP's tradition was that the company decided to change its filming schedule by consolidating all of their weekly traveling shows into just one night on Wednesday in Raleigh, North Carolina, and then simply just syndicating the shows throughout their territory. Eventually, they would change their filming location yet again. This time, it would be to WPCQ TV Studios in Charlotte, which was almost serendipitously once owned by Ted Turner, but we'll be getting more into him later on. And as far as their TV talent went, their programming featured a lot of big local stars hosting their programs, like Charlie Harville and Big Bill Ward. They were eventually replaced when the show became known as Mid-Atlantic Championship Sport, which was hosted by several different personalities, such as Les Thatcher, Dr. Tom Miller, and the man who would end up taking over for good, another one of Crockett Sr.'s sons, David Crockett, king of the wild frontier. But don't feel too bad for some of the previous hosts that I mentioned, as Bill Ward would go on to host a short-lived second show called East Coast Wrestling, and then another supplementary show called Wide World Wrestling would take that show's place, hosted by Ed Capral, followed by a series of other hosts, such as the previous mentioned names of Les Thatcher and Dr. Tom Miller, as well as newcomers Rich Landrum and Johnny Weaver. And the latter two would get to host a different show in 1978 called The Best of NWA Wrestling. Now, this show had an interesting format. It featured Weaver, who was still wrestling Wrestling at the time, having guest stars on the show to review matches in a coaching style format. And here, things would really start to pick up for the promotion, as the JCP was allowed to expand to West Virginia, Tennessee, and Savannah, Georgia, which was a big deal since the nearby Atlanta had always been considered a prime location for professional wrestling. But the good news didn't stop there either, as Crockett would continue to grow even further, moving into Ohio cities such as Cincinnati and Dayton. But the biggest acquisition came when Crockett gained a third of the company known as Maple Leaf Wrestling, which was owned by Frank Tunney, who was the uncle of WWF's eventual kayfabe president Jack Tunney. Now, by gaining a major part of the OG MLW, Jim Crockett Promotions was now able to start airing in upstate New York, which is beginning to encroach upon McMahon country, but just keep all this in mind because we're definitely not done talking about MLW yet. After this, the company's growth would become even more apparent, when Crockett Jr. started consolidating some of the NWA Southern territories and stopped promoting themselves as Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling and instead just started calling themselves the NWA flat out, even though the NWA was still a distinctly different entity. But apparently the alliance really didn't mind all that much since Jim Crockett Jr. was elected president of the NWA in 1980, with Ole Anderson of Georgia Championship Wrestling fame taking over as head booker for JCP. And the following year, Ole would end up booking for both promotions, which just goes to show the immense growth and success of Jim Crockett Jr. and Jim Crockett Promotions. However, all that was about to change. In 1983, Vince McMahon Sr. asked George Scott if he could please help his son Vincent Kennedy McMahon, who had just taken over the company that we would now know today as WWE. Scott agreed as him and Vince McMahon Sr. were friends. So from there, Scott went to Atlanta, and this was just in time to oversee WWF's acquisition of TBS's Saturday night time slot, which was previously occupied by Georgia Championship Wrestling, and this event would eventually become known as Black Saturday. Now, this whole ordeal really does deserve a bit more attention, but I'm just going to give you a quick overview for the purposes of this story. Here's the rundown. Vince McMahon Jr. wanted to expand WWF's reach across the entire nation, and GCW had a really juicy deal with Turner Broadcasting, airing a show called World Championship Wrestling. But if only Vince McMahon could get his hands on that deal, then he would have control over all nationally aired professional wrestling in America. But when he approached Ted Turner about buying the time slot, billionaire Ted just laughed in his face and said no. However, McMahon would not take no for an answer. So to counter this, Vinnie Mac decided to just go straight to the source, and he bought the stakes of 3 of GCW's owners, leaving Ole Anderson only holding a third of the company that Vince McMahon did, thus allowing Vince McMahon to swoop on into WCW's time slot. As a result, TBS created a brand new professional wrestling program in order to appease their fan base that wasn't so happy with WWF being on their TV. And for this new show, they decided to give it to a new, small, up-and-coming promotion called Championship Wrestling from Georgia. All this led to Vince McMahon's first major failure as an owner, leaving him no choice but to sell the time slot. However, he refused to sell it to Ted Turner, and instead sold it to Jim Crockett Jr. for $1 million. After this, and going back to Maple Leaf Wrestling, Jack Tunney was now in charge, and he would partner up with Vince McMahon, giving the WWF the Toronto territory. And because of this, along with this new thing called WrestleMania and a new star named Hulk Hogan, Crockett had to respond quickly if they were going to remain competitive. So in order to gain ground across the country, Crockett either had to partner up with other promotions, or he had to try and beat Vince McMahon at his own game and buy them, which is exactly the plan of attack that Crockett did, joining forces with Championship Wrestling from Georgia, Jarrett Promotions, and the AWA in order to create Pro Wrestling USA, which unfortunately went under in January of 1986. Despite this, Crockett was still elected into his second term as NWA president, and this time around they were going to make one big last-ditch effort in order to gain total domination. Having already bought Vince McMahon's TBS time slot, Crockett brought back the old WCW show on Saturday nights, filmed at Ted Turner's Atlanta studios. This show, which was now being run by Crockett and JCP's head booker at the time, Dusty Rhodes, would become wildly successful. So much so that they were even able to create a brand new event called The Great American Bash. And then in Crockett's third term as president of the NWA, he was able to acquire even more turf, with Championship Wrestling from Florida, the heart of America's sports attractions, the St. Louis Wrestling Club, and Mid-South Wrestling, all now operating under the NWA banner. But all of this expansion came at a cost, as traveling expenses definitely aren't cheap. And to make matters worse, the gates for these events really weren't what Crockett had hoped for. And on top of that, another devastating blow came to the JCP on pay-per-view. In 1987, Vince McMahon was ready to crush his competition, so he decided to come up with a brand new pay-per-view event, Survivor Series, which was going to air on the exact same day as Starrcade. Now, Crockett didn't want to lose straight up to Vince McMahon in pay-per-view competition, so he decided to move Starrcade to earlier in the day. However, unbeknownst to him, Vince McMahon had an even more devastating plot in mind. McMahon threatened pay-per-view providers by saying that if they aired Starrcade, they wouldn't be allowed to air Survivor Series or the following year's WrestleMania. And since WWF was by far the bigger selling product, most companies decided to go with Vince. Now, of course, this took a huge toll on the pay-per-view buy rate of Starrcade, but the live attendance? Well, that didn't help much either, with the event being held in Chicago, which was an area that was not as familiar with Jim Crockett Promotions as their home base of the Carolinas was. And their OG territory was definitely upset about losing such a major event to another city. This problem would repeat itself with the Bunkhouse Stampede, which took place in New York State, with the live audience for this pay-per-view only being about 6,000 in attendance. And remember, this is about the size of a good house show for WWF at the time. And plus, this only worked to enrage original JCPW fans even more. Plus, the pay-per-view buy rate for the event was dramatically undercut when WWF decided to air on the same night and on basic cable the very first Royal Rumble. And what wasn't helping either was that even though Jim Crockett Jr. was the president of the entire National Wrestling Alliance, and all these promotions were still working under the NWA banner, Crockett was definitely still JCP at heart, with the NWA title being locked around the waist of Jim Crockett Promotions wrestler Ric Flair. Because as successful as a heel champion can be, it was going to take a major babyface in order to combat Hulkamania. Therefore, Crockett decided to start investing heavily upon a brand new top star, a young, handsome, charismatic wrestler to rival the popularity of Hulk Hogan and to finally take the title off of the dominant Ric Flair. That wrestler was Magnum TA. But unfortunately, Magnum TA would be involved in a car accident and he would never wrestle again. Plus, in another example of JCP favoritism backfiring, Crockett pushed his stars over talent from other promotions like the UWF. And some say that if Crockett just made better use of the talent that he had at his disposal from the different promotions that he was working with, then maybe they could have crafted more stars, which would definitely have been a good thing. And lastly, in another odd case of history repeating itself, Crockett was spending way more money than they could possibly afford, with the limousine riding and jet flying not being a work because it's exactly what Crockett provided to his top stars, along with throwing some lavish parties. And even worse still, when Crockett took on the UWF, they also inherited all the debt that the company had. So, with the cost of advertising and not paying to get the exposure necessary in all the areas that you were expanding into, undervaluing stars that could have helped elevate your company, failing to find a new top babyface megastar, undervaluing a lot of the talent that you did have, getting beat thoroughly in the pay-per-view market, as well as spending way more money than you possibly should have, it was no wonder that Jim Crockett Promotions would find itself on the verge of bankruptcy, leaving Jim Crockett Jr. no choice but to sell his company for $9 million to Ted Turner. Jim Crockett Promotions under Turner became World Championship Wrestling, the name of the old show, and Jim Crockett Jr. would stay on as a consultant and the Crockett family would maintain a minority interest. However, those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it, with WCW's own aggressive spending being one of the reasons that eventually led to their own sale to Vince McMahon. Well, there you go, the rise and fall of Jim Crockett Promotions. But what are some of your favorite JCPW memories? Let me know down in the comments, and please make sure that you're subscribed to this channel. And I also want to give a big thank you to all my Patreon supporters out there. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, Dave knows.